Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Christians Questions, a project from the New Tolerance Campaign. Today I have with me a great guest, Gabriel Nadales. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He is a free speech activist and an author of Behind the Mask, The Black Mask, My Time as an Antifa Activist. As a former far-left activist with the anti-fascist movement, Gabriel has spoken to over 100 college campuses to warn students about the dangers of political extremism, violence, censorship, and critical race theory. Gabriel holds a bachelor's degree in general studies with a concentration in social justice essentials from Southern New Hampshire University. How are you doing today, Gabriel?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we get started, are there any projects you're working on? Anything you'd like to plug to our audience?
Sure. I mean, right now we're very much engaged in a campaign in Atlanta, part of our Safer Streets, Brighter Futures campaign.
Hmm.
This campaign is really about highlighting the cities that are being ignored by the mainstream media as well as politicians. Because when people are talking about crime, when you hear about crime, you hear what's going on in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, Portland, some of these major cities. But what ends up happening is that many smaller cities get ignored. We're talking about Milwaukee, Tucson, Arizona, Atlanta, Georgia, despite the fact that the problems that are happening in major cities like New York, like Los Angeles, are happening in these smaller cities, yet they get no attention. So the campaign is really to bring to really shine a light on the struggles that are happening to all Americans from all walks of life.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. So tell me, and this is probably the question you get most, but we're going to go into more depth, I promise you. How did you first get involved with Antifa? Just
Sure.
jump there.
So really, to understand my involvement with the Antifa movement, you have to go all the way back to when I first started being an activist. I've been an activist for a very long time, 18 years, in fact. About in 2006 is when I was first politically active. Now, this is very minor, but nonetheless, I remember in '06 when there was a bill in the House. I believe it passed the House. It didn't pass the Senate, but this bill was going to criminalize uh illegal border crossings. Now, when we're talking about criminalizing, everyone knows that it is a crime to cross a border illegally. That said, though, it would have changed the penalties from civil versus, which means you get kicked out and then you are not allowed to come in, for a certain period of time. It would actually put them in jail. It actually would like put a lot of people in jail. So it passed the House of Representatives, and there was a huge uproar against it. And I remember that's really the first time I actually started paying attention to politics. I'm like, okay, this is not good, because the way the media made it seem at the time, it was that this was going to be used not just against illegal immigrants, but also as a means to discriminate against all immigrants. Myself being an immigrant, I was born in Mexico. I thought this is not good for me. It's not good for my family. It's not good for my friends. A lot of us are immigrants. A lot of people weren't born here. This is not a good thing. So what can a sixth grader do? You know, there was protests around the community. We in school, just having our voice heard. We were saying things against what we believed, and I was part of those protests. I mean, that's really where I really started, very, very small. And there was a sense of I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed advocating for some cause. It's something that I've always really been. It's just very much intrigued me very much. And I started doing more and more. From there, I graduated over to anti-war protests, as well as protesting Governor Schwarzenegger when he was trying to cut the teacher budget. This is back in 2009 when he was the governor of California, the governor. And a lot of times I would just go with groups. I would go and they would advertise, but the teacher unions would pass out flyers about the pink protest. I mean, I'll be there. They were trying to cut the music budget at one point for our I believe they cut workshop, the wood shop at one point, but they were trying to cut the music budget, and I'm like, no, I like music, like that shouldn't be cut. So I would go to their meetings. This is the small little steps that I would take in in my activism very early on. But after doing this for several years, I started to feel like a lot of the things that I did really didn't make a difference. So I started getting really tired of marching and doing these things, especially when it came to some of the bigger things like anti-war. I was always an anti-Iraq, after anti-Afghanistan activist, you know. But despite the fact that I would go to these events in Los Angeles, it just seemed like there was nothing actually going on. Like nothing was stopping it. So that's something that I call the activist fatigue, where you get tired of marching, you get tired of passing flyers because no one seems to listen and nothing seems to change. Now, this is 2011 when there was an anti-fascist rally in my community, and I decided to attend. This is how easy it was for me. I just went. I was 17 at the time, and that's how I ended up linking up with a lot of those people. This is really, really, really early on, but it was about 5 years of me being in 5 years. I had been an activist for about 5 years at this point.
Wow, wow. And so you were dissatisfied over a lot of the things you saw going on in the country. When was the moment that you basically just took the jump and became identified with the Antifa movement? And we're going to talk about if it's a movement organization a little bit, but for sake of argument, the movement, when was that one catalyst?
You're gonna have to forgive me. It cut off a little bit.
Oh yeah,
And
no, no, no. So my question was, what was the one catalyst moment that got you involved in Antifa? All the
sure,
dissatisfaction, what was that one catalyst?
as I mentioned, there was an Antifa rally. This is in Claremont, California, in March of 2011. And there was a neo-Nazi rally around the corner from, I used to live in Azusa, and Claremont is about 2, 3 cities over. And I've heard that there was Nazis there, and I I didn't know, but I just knew that there was going to be like Antifa activists there. And I already knew about Antifa from that. And one of the reasons that I do, and this is a little bit of like Antifa history. So the Antifa that people talk about, like from the original Antifa, let's say, it's from the late 1929 to early 1930s, and it was Nazi Germany. It's called the Anti-Fascist Aktion, whatever. It looks similar, spelled similar, but slightly different. So that was an actual organization. It was a political force, and that's what it was. They basically died out because Nazi Germany won that war, and they basically destroyed all anti-fascist organizing. After the war, some of the remnants still were there, and actually, interestingly enough, some of the Italian anti-fascists committed war crimes against Germans. But that's a different story. Now, basically, that Antifa died out. There was some Antifa type actions and groups all throughout history, but modern Antifa really comes from the 1980s. In the 1980s in America, it used to be called the Anti-Racist Action, and in the UK, it was known as Antifa. In America, what they used to do, they used to tour around with punk music groups, and go beat up neo-Nazis. They did this for several different years. The Anti-Racist Actions did in 2007, I believe it was, that the Anti-Racist Action chapter of Portland, Oregon, rebranded itself to Antifa, to Rose City Antifa. That chapter is the oldest, longest serving like chapter like in America, period. It's not the first, but it's definitely the oldest still active chapter. Now, I was gonna say, the reason they decided to change their name, it's really goes back to 1999 during the WTO protest in Washington. At these protests, a lot of radical groups, they were anarchist, socialist, communist, Antifa groups, eco groups, whatever they're called, like some of those people that are advocating for environmental racism or against environmental racism, animal rights groups, they all coalesced there because they started to believe that they all had a common enemy, which is the capitalist system, and they started seeing that. So the reason the anti-racist action rebranded as Antifa was so they could fight more than neo-Nazis, and they started saying that they started defining fascism in a very very broad spectrum. It wasn't just neo-Nazis, it wasn't just like a skinheads, it was capitalists, it was people who were part of the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, people, Americans who hung an American flag. This has became very, very broad. And this is kind of where I began to be involved sometime in 2011. So that's kind of where I was. Now, modern Antifa has gone even beyond that. Sometime around 2016, to be anti-fascist meant to be anti-Trump, because he was the latest example of American fascism, if you will, at least through their eyes. Um, so
Yeah, interesting. No,
no, no,
interesting.
no. So
Yeah.
I'm getting off topic. Your question is, how did I actually get involved with this group? Like going back, it's just sometimes I get off tangents
It's
into
all
the.
right. It's all right. It's interesting.
Okay, so
It's
how did I
important.
get involved in this group? So I started reading a lot about them and listening to a lot of music by some of the anti-racist action type groups. I'm talking about Oz Rotten, some of Crass is one of them. Although interestingly enough, Crass, this is kind of like for some nerds of the anarcho punk music, which, but sadly, it's gonna be. It's funny because the only people who listen to anarcho punk music or like people who are kind of like me or people or like Antifa type activists. But interestingly enough, Crass, even though it's credited to be as like one of the first Antifa type groups, they were the one group, the anarcho punk group in the UK that was actually actively speaking out against Antifa, which is just like interestingly like little side note. And that actually is going to get a lot of if there's any anarchists listening to this who are part of the anti-fascist movement and like Crass, they don't like to admit that fact. But that's a separate. That's an aside. Anyways, um, so a lot of this music, that history was there. It's in their records. It's in the like the lyrics. And when you look into the lyrics, you read more about Antifa. So I knew that Antifa was going to be there. I had no proof. I just knew that there was going to be people wearing a black mask. So I got dressed in a black mask, and then I went to these anti-Nazi rally, and that's how I got involved. Literally, some people came up to me and they said, "Hey, do you want to join us?" And I said, "Yes." That's all it is.
Wow.
Um, yeah.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. Okay. So I have a few questions. Oh,
Sure.
everything you said is very fertile ground for more questions. So my first question is this, more of an observation than a question a little bit after the observation. A lot of folks in our contemporary political discourse, they enjoy ascribing a lot of motivations to the left that are more, I think, caricatures as opposed to what their actual motivation is. For example, you may have heard in recent conversations that a lot of people are convinced that the left, generally speaking, in their cultural and social programs, are decidedly anti-white and they are decidedly racist. Now, evidently, if you look at critical race theory, there's a bunch of things against white people there. There's a bunch of what seems racist. But I think what you've kind of revealed is that, and this is something that I think more people should know, is that oftentimes these radical groups use race as a proxy for capitalism. They use race as a proxy for the power structure in the system. So can you walk us through that? Because a lot of folks don't get that, and that misleads them into thinking wrongly about these issues.
Sure. I mean, really, when you look at all of these, it's they would like to frame all of their issues as oppressor versus the oppressed. When we're looking at Antifa, when you have the fascists, those are the oppressors, and everybody who is Antifa is the oppressed, and that justifies any and all actions against the oppressed, against the oppressors by the oppressed. And you're right, these groups aren't necessarily like inherently anti-white. They are, but they see as white as many oftentimes as the oppressors. So anybody who wants to fight against the oppressors are the oppressed. This can include white people. This can include anybody who, as long as they are willing to admit that their race is part of the oppressor class. And it really, it's really important to be able to see it like that, to understand that they see it like that, because that really explains why they are so willing to take the side of Hamas, for example. Many activists, students for justice in Palestine, for example, and like many Antifa type activists, they are willing to march with or at least alongside Palestinian flags, or even some people who are wearing. There was this student, or I don't know if it's a student, likely a student, out in Stanford University, who even put on like the Hamas like get up, like the bandana and the whole thing. And the reason why is because they see them as the oppressed, and therefore anything that they do is therefore justified against the oppressor, despite the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They are willing, like, it's so funny and ironic and just sad to
Yeah.
see LGBT flags right alongside like Palestinian and Hamas flags, or like Hamas symbols, because there's nothing there tying them together except the fact that they see them as both the oppressed.
Right, absolutely. No, it's tragic, and I think it's a parody of our times to see that
Yeah.
nonsense. But so moving on back to your more personal experience with Antifa, because I think it's very important to get that kind of ideological thing out of the way, because a lot of folks think about these issues in a way that seems plausible. And then folks with like big followings will then lead into that, but it's not actually as substantive as what you just said. So I appreciate you for that. So when you were in Antifa, what was a typical day like for you when it came to your political activities? What was your focus, so to speak?
Sure. So before we get there, I do want to talk about what Antifa is and what it's not. I know you alluded to a little bit, but
Yes. Okay.
uh,
I can ask that first then. So,
sure.
okay. So I have a question about that. Okay.
Okay.
So there was a big debate a few years ago about when Trump was planning to said he wanted to label Antifa a terrorist organization. There was a massive debate about if it was a movement or an organization. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
So the best way to understand Antifa is as a movement, not an organization. That said, within this movement, there are several different individuals or radical move or organizations that do fall within that movement. Some of them call themselves Antifa, but some of them don't. Let's see if you like. I'll put it in terms of both the liberal and the progressive movement. There
Yeah.
is no conservative organization. There's no organization that's like we are the conservative organization. Yet there are groups like I don't know, Turning Point USA, the Republican Party, what other group has it? I don't know, America First, or so, whatever group, conservative, similar for the progressive movement. There really is no the progressive movement. Maybe there's a group out there that calls itself the progressive movement or the progressive organization, but even they are not the progressive movement. Within the progressive movement, you have Students for Justice in Palestine, you have Democratic Socialists of America, all those. The way you see Antifa, you have to see it in the same light. Antifa movement, you have all these different groups. Some of them call themselves Antifa. You have Rose City Antifa, you have Sacramento Antifa, Denver Antifa, all of these. But you also have 161's crew in San Francisco, Las Cruces United Against Racism in New Mexico. You have some chapters, not all, but most chapters of the Anarchist Black Cross, all of these different things. And within that movement, you have people who are not necessarily part of an organization, but they're also within that movement itself. For example, I was never a member of any organization and that was Antifa or like related. That's why even though there's a bunch of different like articles that say that I'm an Antifa member, I always try to correct the record, but that is inaccurate because I was never part of Rose City Antifa. I was never part of those or some of these. I knew people who were members of some of these groups, but I always defined myself as an Antifa activist because I was marching alongside with some of these uh some of the some of the within this movement and stuff. Now, what is my typical day like as an Antifa activist is? I was on the younger side, so I wasn't living this life. It was definitely something that would come every weekend or every other weekend. There would be an activism or like something that I would attach my name to. Uh, there actually not really my name, but I would attach myself to. Anyways, so some of the things that I was a part of was the Occupy movement. My friends and I would go over to Los Angeles to be part of those on the weekends, as well as whenever there was like an animal rights thing going on, we would just go. I always talk about this specific instance. I believe there was a company in California that they told me was transporting monkeys to America to conduct vivisections for some sort of research. I don't know exactly the details, but this is just what they told me. And w- from that, we would go to the home of the CEO and just harass the hell out of him. We'd stand there and just yell obscenities and in front of their house, really. Yell obscenities, yell all these crazy things, and trying to pressure him to stop the contracts with that French airline or whatever it might be. You know, yeah, there was a lot of going on because
Yeah.
me being from Azusa, there wasn't ever much going on in Azusa or the San Gabriel Valley in general. Most of the things that I went to were in San Francisco, not San Francisco, sorry, in Los Angeles or Orange County.
Yeah. So you kind of alluded to this, but this activism you did when you were affiliated with the movement, how did it impact your worldview and your outlook on politics? Did you see things in a kind of more like emotion and passion driven way? Or was there a broader sense of justice you were aspiring towards?
I mean, there was obviously a lot of passion. I was recently at an Atlanta City Council and as part of the Safer Streets, Better Futures campaign. And I met some people who were claimed to be at least part of the Antifa movement. I believe them, but it is important to note that they are all it's a green movement, an anarcho green movement there going on. Nonetheless, um I heard them speak, or many of them speak in front of the city council, and I saw this great passion in them and how they were morally justified in what they were doing. And they were calling us out by name. They were saying like, "Oh, like they don't know what we're talking about," etc., etc., etc. But there is something, dare I say, inspiring about the passion that they display. I think they're wrong, and I think it's dangerous to be that passionate, but there is something about a young person who wants to speak out against the world, and I remember myself having that same passion, so I empathize to an extent with them. The problem with passion is that it can lead us astray. It's very dangerous when we're advocating so passionately for something because we are unwilling to hear any criticism of our work. We get heated, we get angry, and when we get angry, that can be very, very problematic. I know that there's people who like Daryl Davis, which I deeply admire Daryl Davis, who says that passion is great, and like if people are yelling at each other at the very, that's still good because at the very least we're not attacking each other. But once you're getting into passion, you're getting dangerously close to taking it a level further, which would be physical action against another person. So passion is admirable, but it's also incredibly dangerous. So I very much, the way I saw it back then is I was doing the right thing and darn anybody who opposed me.
When was the moment you disaffiliated, left, whatever word you want to use, the Antifa movement? Like what did it for you? What caused
So
you to
there's
stop?
a lot of people like to use, and I've never liked this term, but a lot of people like to ask me, what red pill you? I've never liked this term because
Yeah.
well, modernly it's because the red pill community has become its own community, and I'm definitely not part of the red pill community.
Yeah, it's
But
complex. Yeah.
yeah, it's complex. Let's leave
Yeah,
it at that.
very much so.
Nonetheless, the reason why I've always hated this term is because it doesn't really capture my experience. Red pill, it seems like you take a pill and then you just all of a sudden realize, like, oh, what am I doing? And it was never like that for me. There are two instances that I like to point to. Number one is when I was uh around the time when I was 18, I started reading a lot of material that was opposed to what I believed. Particularly, I like to point to material from Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman. Now, at the time, I didn't like them, but I found them interesting. Interesting enough that I wanted to talk about their ideas with my friends. Well, as soon as I talked with them about them, they called me a capitalist pig. And that's when I realized that I really wasn't getting the full picture of what I believed. So, several months were passing and I was reading, I was looking more into it, and I started college. And in college, I was able to find uh people who were of the libertarian persuasion and conservative persuasion who had a conversation with me, and they just told me that they were regular people in more and less words than those. And that's when I realized I can't keep demonizing people who disagree with me, because these are just regular people. And I never really told anybody that I was like really leaving the movement per se. I just started not self-identifying with it. I started running more. I started going to less events. Now that's a slow transition that was several months in the making. But there is one point where I decided to really just completely cut a lot of people out of my life. As I mentioned, Antifa, modern Antifa, used to be part of the anarcho-punk movement. And within the anarcho-punk movement, you typically have shows and gigs. They're definitely not played at sometimes, but at concert halls or even like clubs. You typically have them in backyards. You typically have them in basements. It's probably one of my funnest one where it was in a small little basement and there was like 50 people. Anyways, uh, this one that I'm thinking about was in someone's backyard, and this one was in Azusa too, which is crazy because that's why I went. If I had been anywhere else, I would have skipped it, just like I had skipped many of them. But this one was in Azusa, my hometown. That's exactly where I lived. And I remember that there was the when you're at these shows, the house will typically not let you go into the restroom, so everybody always establishes a pee corner. So there's a pee corner, and
Peacorn.
yeah, pee corner. Just go there, you pee.
Wow.
So yeah, this is common.
Wow.
Anyways, so I remember that there was this couple who were having sex there, and it's gross, but that's what's happening. And there was a lot of people who took notice, and they were snickering. People were taking pictures, etc., doing all these crazy things. And then I noticed that the owner of the house what came up to them and kicked them from behind. And I thought to myself, well, of course, like these guys are stupid, like they're gonna get like jumped. And that's uh then I saw one of my friends go up to them and try to like stand between them. It's like, hey, come on, let's calm down. And I was like, ooh, I need to go grab my friend because he's about to get jumped. So I went up to him, I pulled him by the backpack, and I was like, hey, you need to leave. You don't know these people. These people are gang affiliated. We do not want to be involved here. And that's when I noticed that the couple having sex, well, they were my friends. So uh
Wow.
there was this huge rumble. If people want to read about it, it's in my book. But there was a huge rumble, and I remember that at one point I was on the floor getting jumped. Actually, I don't remember this. I seriously don't remember this. But one of my friends swears that this happened. I remember being on the floor. I don't remember getting jumped. I remember being on the floor, not being able to get up, but like I don't remember getting. It's probably adrenaline or something. I don't know. But I remember that we were treated to the police, gang unit, K9. We even had a helicopter circling around. And after all of this, we went to my friend's basement, who lived only a few blocks away, and not basement, garage. And from there, we were just all looking around. There was about 20 or so of us, many of us who got into that fight, and it was insane because I just thought like I I don't want to be part of this. I don't like the people that I'm hanging out with. That's when I realized that I needed to cut out a lot of people from my life. And I just stopped replying. I stopped hanging out. I just cut it out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose we already have the answer to this, but I'm curious if you were to see any of your former Antifa cohorts today, would you be considered a pariah?
I don't think many of them even realized that I left.
Really?
Honestly,
That's interesting.
and maybe they do, maybe some of them don't. But I remember in 2017, I was in my hometown again, and I saw two of them, and they were riding their skateboard, and I'm like, dude, you guys are older than me. Like they were in their late 20s at that point. And they were riding their skateboard, and they were well, actually one of them, he's a year younger than me and stuff. And they were outside In and Out, and I saw them, and one of them told me he had just gotten out of prison, and he had a baby. and they in their backpack they had beers or 40 ounces or 32 ounces rather, and 40 ounces and stuff. And they were telling me about it. They asked me if I wanted to hang out. I was like, no, I'm good, you know. And I like it was just like a wild little like catch up with them. And this is before I spoke out about it, actually. This oh maybe I don't know. No, this is 2018. So this is before I really spoke out about it. So maybe they do know now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm mixing up my dates. Yeah, so I wonder if they know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put it past them, but at the same time, the fact that they're really dealing with their own lives, that like, one of them had just gotten out of prison. I guess he got assaulted somebody. He was in there for about a year. And like I wouldn't be surprised if many of them are too preoccupied with their own struggles, their own addictions, than to realize. Because this is what one of the things that you have to remember. When you're part of the Antifa movement, there's a lot of people who cycle in and out. I was one of those. Typically, if you see people who are in the movement for 5 years, for 10 years, those are the dangerous ones. Those are the people that you have to be watch out for. And so, and it's not hard to tell which ones they are. A matter of fact, they do their best to be in the background, and they allow the younger people to do a lot of dirty work because they don't want to go to prison. Sometimes you catch them like they did in San Diego. They just put a couple of people away. But at the same time, many of these activists, they're in the movement for just as long as I've been an activist, 20 years, 25 years, and they are able to get away with it because they know what lines to cross and when to cross them. And so they can continue to do this time and time again. And I mean, they actually did meet this gentleman. He was in the movement for about 5 years. He has a great book out, which is called Black Bloc Anarchist. Forgetting his last name. His name is Aaron. And if people want to check out that book, it's a heavy book. I provided some guidance when he was writing it, and I helped him get it published. But he was active as an anarchist from the late 2000s to up to 2005, and he even met one of the activists that is still active to this day, and whose name I cannot remember, but there was a long form article about him. He was active over in Ohio, and he is somebody who is organizing people nationwide, or maybe not nationwide, but he has connects nationwide, and he is active to this day with local Antifa type chapters and stuff. So, as I mentioned, this guy was active for about 5 years, so his connections are much deeper than mine ever were and stuff. So, if people want to hear more about that or read more about that, Black Bloc Anarchist, it's a great, great book.
Absolutely. One last question before we close out here. What has your experience been with audiences that you go to talk about your story? Have they been curious? Have they been accepting? I guess one more question as well. What do you consider yourself now politically, if you don't
Sure.
mind me asking?
Sure. So, let's answer the first one first. It's really interesting. As part of when I was speaking for the Leadership Institute, when I did that for a couple, maybe 3 years, I was going to a lot of conservative chapters throughout the country, and I spoke at over 100 colleges, and a lot of the reception was many conservatives who are afraid to speak out in academia because they're afraid that they're going to get kicked out. They're afraid that they're going to lose their grade. They're going to lose their scholarship. They're going to do all of these bad things. And that is very, very harmful. Um, and so their reception was very warm, with the exception of a couple places that I got canceled over at Dartmouth University, at University of High Point, North Carolina. I can't remember what university. I never made it on campus. I was banned from campus actually.
Wow.
And but I did a TED talk in Chicago, Illinois, and it was actually really, really. I'm so glad I did that talk because at that talk, it was the first time that I spoke to an audience that was not conservative, just plainly not conservative. They were definitely open-minded. They were not progressive, but they were not, TED Talk viewers are very diverse. You have conservatives, you have libertarians, you have very moderates, you have a lot of people. And that was very eye-opening for me because they were just completely unaware of what's going on when it comes to like radical activists. They asked me about my college's experience after my speech, and they were just like they just couldn't believe that that happened. They asked me for examples, and I gave it to them, and they were like, "Wow!" Like and it was multiple people. It was about 3 or 4 different people who they were just they were impressed, not in a good way, impressed with the fact that this is going on college campuses today. Um, but I started to realize that conservatives often live in a bubble. We could talk about
Mhm.
like I have this thing right here. Your bubble is boring, you know. We
Yeah,
talk about
yeah.
popping the bubble with free speech, and that's true. But unfortunately, we have also created a bubble for ourselves, and it's really a counterculture. And I think in part this is effect of the fact that that conservatives and to an extent libertarians have been pushed out, and they have to create their own bubble, but they create their own groups to combat them, you know, to combat the other organization. I think mm, this may necessarily not be the greatest example, but Riley Gaines is, I think, an example of this, and where she's talking about how like women should refuse to compete with transgender activists. It to an extent, I get why she's doing it, but she in effect is creating a bubble outside of that place, and that's in part why I don't really consider myself a conservative. I'm
Interesting.
definitely libertarian. My ideals are very much libertarian, but I am looking to engage people who are sick and tired of the extreme. I'm looking for liberals who are dissatisfied with the Democrat Party, who are dissatisfied with Antifa, who people who want to speak out against Antifa and against the radical progressives, but they feel like they don't have a voice. I am really looking to for a new movement that really encapsulates these ideas. And part of my work at Our America is really to seek out people who are like that, people who are both on the conservative and the liberal movement, progressive movement, who are, again, they're dissatisfied with the extremes and they don't want to be part of the extreme. And they want to be considered Americans first before anything else.
Hmm. Right. Absolutely. Well, this has been a very insightful talk. I appreciate your time, Gabriel. Is there any last words you have for the audience before we go?
You know, I normally do, but I just think I do really appreciate this conversation. I mean, I've been telling this story for several years now. And it's crazy that people are still interested in it.
Of
It's
course.
crazy because it's just like, I mean, you know, I did that, you know, and I keep trying to look forward, but like, you know, I did all that, and it's crazy to me that there's so much interest on that. But uh, I really hope that as we march forward, we can get rid of the extremes, no matter where they lie.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Gabriel, and everyone else. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.